Welcome, and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. Joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today is David Daly. He is the editor-in-chief of Salon magazine, and we're going to discover his personal interviews with GOP strategists involved in Operation Red Map. It's a story in his book of what happens when a team of considerably smart Republican operatives spend $30 million to influence down-ballot strategists involved in this Operation Red Map. The book is, well, we'll certainly let him tell us what the title should be, but the true story behind the secret plan to steal America's democracy, and I'd like to welcome David Daly to the Beyond 50 radio program. David, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Daniel.
Now,
I appreciate it.
Are you getting radio show hosts having a lot of fun trying to figure out how they should actually say the title of this book?
I am. That's actually been one of the most enjoyable aspects of all of this.
Okay.
We seem to be ending up on Ratf.
Ratf. Okay. I know on YouTube you can say anything you want to. It seems everybody does. But tell us what's going on here. It's kind of funny because as you read this, you realize, well, you know, in politics this has been going on since even the Roman Empire days. Let's figure out how to take the laws, stretch them around so we can take advantage of this so we get our agenda covered here. What's going on?
Well, you know, the amazing thing is it gets better and easier to do things like this and to lock it in for a longer period of time. You're completely right. I mean, politicians have tried to gerrymander and rig the electoral map since the beginning of the Republic. And by gerrymandering, what we mean is every 10 years after the census, all of the legislative lines and all of the congressional districts get redrawn. But from 1790 up until about 2000, you can lump that entire era together as sort of the horse and buggy era of redistricting. In 2010, a handful of brilliant Republican strategists figure out how to launch the rocket ship era of redistricting. And with Operation Red Map, for a bargain basement price, they lock in control of the House of Representatives for the next decade until the next census by focusing on a handful of elections, state elections in states across the country, which would give them control of the redistricting process in the next year.
So let's try to give our listeners an idea of how this works. I think I've got a pretty good understanding, but you're basically going into districts that have a weak voting population and trying to build strength for the right-wingers, I guess, if you want to call them that, to be able to have some influence and actually grow in those areas that would normally kind of be marginal at best. Is that the best way to kind of summarize it?
Yeah, it's a complicated idea, but these districts get redrawn every 10 years, and the goal of the partisans who are in charge of this is to draw themselves the best possible districts for their side. So what the Republicans recognize is after the 2008 election, there's now a Democratic supermajority in the Senate. You've elected Barack Obama president. The Democrats have the House. And the Republicans are staring down a demographic wave that doesn't look good for them. And a guy by the name of Chris Jankowski, who's the executive director of something called the Republican State Leadership Committee, hits on an idea. And he says, wait a second, 2008 does not have to be the historic election here. 2010 can be the historic election because that's a 0 year. It's a census year. Elections in 0 years matter more than other ones because immediately after them, we redraw all of these lines. Now, Jankowski is a state government guy. He understands how to spend money to get the policy outcomes he's after in state capitals. And as a result, he understands that 37 of 50 states give state legislatures the primary role in drawing all of the state legislative district lines, and that 42 of the 50 states give the state legislatures the primary role in drawing congressional district lines. So he says, wait a second here. If I study the process in these states, and if I figure out how to get every seat at the table, which is different in every state, I can shut the Democrats out. So he looks at, say, Pennsylvania, for example, where the governor, the state house, and the state senate have the 3 seats at the table when it comes to redistricting. The Democrats held the state house by about 3 seats. So he said, wait a second here. If I go in and if I can flip 6 districts, say, I've got control of the Pennsylvania House. And it's so much cheaper to run a winning campaign on the state house level than it is to have to worry about all of these expensive congressional districts. So they, at a bargain price, pull off this strategy in state after state: Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Colorado, Indiana, Florida, North Carolina. And at the end of 2010, they've elected some 700 new state legislators. They've taken control of 2/3 of the legislative chambers across the country, and they are set up in 2011 in state after state, many of them blue states and purple states, in complete control of redistricting.
Now, for people that may not be familiar with being entrenched into the language of politics, especially what's going on today, what does that exactly mean? What is the effect of something like this?
Sure. Well, you see the effects in 2012 right away, because 2012 is another good year for the Democrats. Barack Obama is reelected. He gets 332 electoral votes. The Democrats win 25 of the 33 Senate seats that are up that year. But the House of Representatives, crucially, stays Republican. Republicans hold on to a 234-201 edge in the House. But if you look at it, Democrats get 1.4 million more votes for their candidates. So the way that the lines were drawn in state after state, as many Democrats as you could into one district, or to crack at the Democrats and spread them across as many districts as possible without being a majority. And when you do that, you influence what all of the neighboring districts look like. So if you look again at Pennsylvania, you get 100,000 more votes for Democratic House candidates, but Republicans take 13 of the 18 seats. If you look at Michigan, it's 240,000 more votes for Democratic House candidates than Republicans. But because of the way the lines are drawn, Republicans take 9 of the 14 seats. It's split down the middle, pretty much 50-50 in Ohio. The way the lines are drawn, Republicans take 12 of the 16 seats. And this repeats itself both at the congressional level and at the state level. The lines are really, really masterfully drawn, and Newt allows them to be so precise and to know what the results will be of including a street or a neighborhood or shoving it into a neighboring district.
Now, it's interesting because, you know, in your book you obviously draw what seems to be the real obvious conclusion when it comes to our political landscape to most people is that there is a system now that is so rigged that it hardly matters anymore who's even running for office.
I think you're right.
You know, and when people get to a point of apathy, you know, it's like, what then do you do?
It's really, really dangerous, you know. I mean, we have 435 congressional districts, and about 400 of them are completely non-competitive. And when districts are non-competitive, it means that it's the only election that matters is the party primary, so you end up getting a more extreme candidate of either side winning, and no one talks to each other anymore. You don't even try to persuade the other side. And then when you get to Congress, you don't want to work with them. You don't want to govern. You don't want to try to collectively solve problems, because if you do put your hand across the aisle, you might earn yourself a primary in the next election, and that's the one thing that can stand in the way of your job. So the reason our politics are so broken and dysfunctional and extreme, and I think the reason why so many of us are so frustrated with it, when you don't see action on issues that a wide majority of the population would like to see, it gets down to this fundamental level of how the districts are drawn. In some ways, until we fix this, we're not going to see progress on any of the issues we'd like to see progress on.
Now, when you talked, or you used the word earlier, gerrymandering, which goes way back. And in fact, this was a time before there was even a congressional body that this started going on, and you lay that out. But I'm kind of curious, as you talk about gerrymandering techniques, you use the terms packing and cracking. What does that mean exactly?
Well, packing is trying to stick as many Democrats or Republicans into one district as you possibly can. So if you look at, say, Michigan's 14th district, which involves a piece of Detroit, it looks like a really strange kind of reclining snake. It's a big S. And it has one kind of long road as its neck, kind of driving 35 miles up towards Pontiac, Michigan, because the goal there is to take all of the African-American voters in Detroit and to link them with all of the African-American voters. You can have one Democratic district, which Brenda Lawrence, a congresswoman there, wins about 80% of the vote every time. And it turns all of the neighboring districts more Republican. And there's all these like little notches and cutouts in that district where they try to carve out little Republican suburban enclaves and attach those into the neighboring districts. It's very, very cleverly done. Cracking, on the other hand, is trying to divide a party's strength. If you look at North Carolina, for example, there's a funky mountain kind of college-y town out in the western part of the state called Asheville that was once represented by a conservative Democrat. When Republicans redrew North Carolina in 2011, they cracked Asheville in half, put half of it into the district of Patrick McHenry, and put half of it into a new district that's now represented by a Tea Party congressman named Mark Meadows. And they created two Republican seats where you'd once had a Republican and a Democrat, simply by dividing the Democrats up so that it did not have enough clout to elect someone of their own choosing.
Now, also to give the listeners an idea about what we're talking about here, to kind of give real direct clarity, is let's consider that back in 2012, that, for instance, in Pennsylvania, President-elect Barack Obama had carried that state by 300,000 votes, according to your book. And the state's Democratic congressional candidates, they collectively outpolled their GOP rivals by nearly 100,000 votes.
Yeah.
Now, that's pretty unanimous when you look at it. We want a Democrat in office. Certainly the GOP in that state was outgunned by 100,000 votes. Mm-hmm. Yet somehow Republicans won 13 of 18 seats in the U.S. House of Representatives. It's like,
it's masterful.
Could you imagine if you could just go to a blackjack table with those kind of odds?
I know. There's a guy at Princeton who actually did run the numbers, and he said if the system wasn't stacked, there was a 1 in 1,000 chance of 13 Republicans and 5 Democrats being elected off of those numbers. I mean, what they did was you had a Democrat in Philadelphia who was actually just convicted on bribery charges the other day in Shaka Fatah, and he received more votes than any Democratic candidate in the country that year in 2012 because so many of them were packed into his district. But it illustrates the big problem here is that it is deeply undemocratic when you get a majority of the votes, but you barely get 28% of the seats. If we are going to have a representative democracy that is effective and responsive, there needs to be a better correlation between votes and seats.
Now, here's something interesting I was told by my producer, in light of the massacre in Orlando, Florida last week.
Yeah.
We have a Democratic sit-in that I understand against a bill that they were trying to push through that would actually begin to really question, who should be allowed to purchase weapons, and under what kind of conditions. And they kind of want to make that stronger. This is something that's been an ongoing debate, obviously, in this country for a very long time. But when you consider what we're talking about here, that Republicans have most of the House, and yet they're trying to bring this bill in to introduce a way to try to make things safer. At least they're trying to move that direction. Republicans just don't want anything to hear about it, and since they're the majority, that's kind of the way it's going to go.
They're the majority of seats, but they're a minority of the votes, and that's the entire problem. I mean, if you look at the numbers behind some of these gun control measures that the Republicans won't bring to the floor, it's 60, 70, 80% approval rating in the country, especially after Orlando. But these initiatives will not move. But I blame the Democrats here as well. The Republicans made it clear what they were going to do in 2010. They announced their intentions in a Karl Rove op-ed piece in the Wall Street Journal of March of that year, in which he said, we are going into all of these state house races, and we're going to win these state house races, and then we're going to flip chambers, and then we're going to control the redistricting, and when you draw the lines, you make the rules. And he's completely right about that. The Democrats never responded to it, and the Democrats haven't figured out how to really generate outrage over the root issue here, which is that our democracy has been taken from us. You didn't see Hillary Clinton talking about this during the campaign. You didn't even see Bernie Sanders talking about this during the campaign. They would both talk about how they would work with Congress, how they would try to get their plans through. Never did they say, the Congress is this way because it's been gerrymandered, and we need to have genuine, nonpartisan redistricting reform before we see any of the results we want. All of those Democrats who were sitting in on the House floor were taking historic direct action, but it was never going to be successful because of the way the lines are drawn. And until we can figure out how to fix that, you're never going to see action on this. And the Democrats have to start talking about it.
Now, it's interesting. You talk about fixing something that's broken, and it's funny how some of the terms you used in here about some of these districts that could be dubbed I'm trying to think of the right thing here, 5 ugliest in the country.
Oh, yeah, boy.
You use terms such as the 8-mile mess, the hanging claw, and pinwheel of death. And I'm thinking to myself, is this our country we're talking about here?
It is. We are the only representative democracy in the world that lets politicians choose their own voters. And when you let that happen, they are going to do it in a really ugly way. And these districts, it's easy to laugh at these districts and give them funny names, but boy, all of those lines exist for a reason. And I got out and drove a lot of these districts and when you do it, you see what's on one side of the road and what's on the other side of the road. All of these lines are there for a reason. The technology that they use is so precise that it looks funny, but it is deadly serious, and it's deadly intentional, and there's a plan behind all of it.
Now, you were saying, too, that it's because of what's been happening here with all of this that this gave rise to upcoming potential presidential nominee Donald Trump. How is this?
Well, I think you can draw a pretty straight line between non-competitive districts and a different kind of candidate that emerges from these districts. When you empower the angriest base of the party, elections become a contest between one person saying, I'm really crazy, and then his challenger going, oh, no, I'm a lot crazier than you are. And that's been the level of discourse in some of these congressional districts. I mean, Meadows is elected on a platform essentially of, I'm going to send Barack Obama back to Kenya. And the people of that district said, that sounds great. Meadows does not like John Boehner any more than he likes Barack Obama. He joins the House Freedom Caucus. He files a parliamentary move that kicks out John Boehner. And you generate such frustration and extremism and anger within the base that when Jeb Bush, when Chris Christie, when John Kasich, when Bobby Jindal, Scott Walker, Marco Rubio, all of these Republicans from essentially the mainstream establishment wing of the party wanted nothing to do with them this year. I mean, Jeb Bush ends up at the Great Hope, spends the tens of millions of dollars and brings home, I think, 4% of the vote in some of these states. And it creates the conditions under which someone like Donald Trump can step in and walk away with the entire party.
You were talking, too, as we try to take a look at the solution to this problem, by getting which would be considered, I guess, separate groups that would actually try to be sure that the redistricting, if you want to call it that, that we play fair. And you talked about how in Arizona in 2000 they did this very thing where they had what could be considered a redistricting board of 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans and 1 independent. But like any 5 kids that get together with a game of Monopoly, somebody's going to figure out a way to lean those things into their favor. So these 5 people who were supposed to be doing allegedly the right thing turned out they were kind of looking out for themselves.
Well, sometimes you see these nonpartisan commissions, but they're actually made up of people who are put there by the politicians. So it becomes just a different kind of partisan. So you end up with 2 Republicans who were sent there to do battle and 2 Democrats who were sent to do battle, and then you have 1 independent chair who is kind of in the middle of all this and is kind of trapped. Although that said, the Republicans down there are convinced that the Democrats got the chair on their side, and they say, well, next time we're going to run a sneaky play to try to get the chair to be one of us. So, first thing it does is it shows just how important redistricting and drawing the lines can be when these parties spend this much time and money and attention on doing it. Even if the people don't understand, the politicians know full well exactly how much control you have when you control the lines. But we have to be careful about reforms that are not really reforms. Politicians are really good at making it look like they're reforming the system when really they've still got their hands on it.
Well, they're certainly good at turning one word into several different meanings, that's for sure.
Yes.
Now, with this, it's kind of interesting, because I believe I remembered reading this particular word in your book, Trumpocalypse. Okay. So how do you see this upcoming election happening here and its outcome? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it is early, but it certainly looks, I think 10 of the last 13 national polls have had Donald Trump in the 30s, which is not a place you want to be if you're running for president, and he's having a lot of trouble raising money. It does seem like he has not completely found his footing as a national candidate. He has time to do that, and he certainly proved during the Republican primary that he was very adept at defeating much more experienced people, but something in his touch seems to have deserted him in the last couple of weeks. That said, he's running against the presumptive nominee of the Democrats, who, if not for Donald Trump, would herself be the most unpopular nominee of a major party in modern times. So clearly anything can happen there. There is a route for Trump, I think, if he can figure out how to appeal to the sort of working class white voters in those industrial states like Pennsylvania, Michigan, Ohio. If there's a way to take those states and turn them red, he's got a map, but it is a tricky one if you don't have a real campaign built up and a real ground game. What I see happening, though, that's more dangerous is I think if you had 1.4 million more votes for Democratic House candidates back in 2012, you're going to see a similar number this year. And the danger is that it's not going to change the balance of the House. Once again, you're going to have millions of more people voting for a Democratic House, but they're not going to get it. And when our democratic institutions cease to be responsive to the voters at the voting box, that is really, really dangerous. And I would be really interested to see what the response is, because it's essentially an illegitimate play, and it is very dangerous for a representative democracy when voters can't turn out and say we're looking for this direction and this change, and they don't get it.
Well, that's absolutely true. That's why you kind of feel that there's something going on in the air, and that maybe a time will come where we actually rise a little harder against that to be sure that we get the direction that we want to go. And I was thinking, as you were talking about feeling that Donald Trump has kind of lost his footing or his touch a little bit here in this election, is, maybe the Republicans found a way to raise the ghost of Lee Atwater and put his antics intact, since Karl Rove seems to have his buttery fingers messing around in it as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, Atwater certainly invented this playbook of trying to raise anger among white voters, and he effectively turned the South bright red, and he made a big redistricting play himself after he elected George Bush, thanks to the Willie Horton ad back in 1988. And it's Atwater who, in some ways, is the genius of the first wave of turning Congress red. It's Atwater who, when he takes over the Republican National Committee, calls his lawyer in and says, you're going to do something about redistricting. And the something that they come up with becomes building an alliance between black Democrats in the South and white Republicans to use the Voting Rights Act to create majority-minority districts, which essentially were an early version that would pack as many Democrats as they could into these districts. And it did elect more black Democrats than at any point in time since Reconstruction. So it worked terrifically as far as increasing representation of minority voices in Congress. On the other hand, it also gave all of the other seats in these states that had been Democratic seats to the Republicans. So there were consequences on both sides there.
One thing I know our listeners will certainly experience as they read your book here is, that it's pretty easy to understand how you're laying all this out. That you really get a feel for what this landscape is. And certainly how people can get involved. You get involved by stepping out on your front porch and taking that next step that's closest to you, and then going from there. And, you know, this is something that can happen, but it's going to take time. After all, it took quite a while for it to get to the condition that it's in. And I want to, first of all, thank you for joining us here, David, on the program today. Is there a website people can discover more and maybe find out how they can get the book and things like that?
You know that the book's available on Amazon. It's available in all your bookstores. It's published by Norton. It has a complicated name, but it has that name because it's what's been done to our democracy, and we need to call it what it is if we're going to try to find a way to stop it. But if you do in fact ask for it book by name on Amazon, if you type it in, you'll find it.
That I'm sure of. And I think your follow-up book is this really helps people turn things around, we hope, as we can call it rat trapped.
I sure hope
we
so.
got those little son of a guns.
That would be fantastic.
Well, again, I want to thank you, David, for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program. It's always a pleasure to get awakened to stuff like this. You bet. We want to thank you, the listeners out there, for joining in. You can also discover more by visiting us at beyond50radio.com. That is the number 50. We encourage you to sign up for our weekly e-newsletter that comes out to you every Thursday night, keeping you up to date on what we're doing here and what's coming up on the program as well. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for joining us. This is the Beyond 50 radio program, and remember, live your day past halfway.